how can I experiment with vegetables and have a satisfying, fulfilling meal, even without the cheese? So it's a change of perspective. And I think that's really the beginning. Look at what you can have, look at what you can enjoy and what you really love, and start from there instead of looking at what you are missing.
Welcome to Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. I'm your host, Nikki Sizemore, and in this podcast, we explore the cultural influences around food and how food connects us and sometimes disconnects us to our minds, our bodies, our spirits, the earth, and our communities. We also talk about recipes, cooking tips, and more. This is a space that is dedicated to bringing more presence, ease, and joy into the process of feeding ourselves. Let's dive in. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I speak with Tuscan food writer and cooking teacher, Giulia Scarpaleggia, all about her recent journey of having to cut dairy out of her diet and what that has meant for her identity, her health, and her well-being. Giulia is the author of 6 cookbooks, including her latest, Cucina Povera. She's also the publisher of the Substack newsletter, Letters from Tuscany. So during this conversation, I realized that Giulia and I have remarkably similar journeys, not only when it comes to how we both found our passion for food and our careers, but also very similar health journeys after we had our first child. So I had my first child 14 years ago, and my journey resulted in me having to cut gluten out of my diet 12 years ago, which many of you know this story. You can listen to past episodes, which I'll link to in the show notes if you want the full story. But for Giulia, this journey began 3 years ago after she had her daughter and resulted in her having to cut out dairy just a couple of months ago. So she's still very much in this journey. While these stories are very personal to Giulia, and I think at this point, we all probably know somebody who has dealt with or is dealing with a food sensitivity. And while I can tell you firsthand, it's hard. It can totally suck. I'm not going to lie. It can also be a really powerful time. There is a silver lining, not only in rediscovering more balance and health in our bodies, but also in discovering delicious new ingredients and recipes. Giulia offers tips for going dairy-free. She shares some of her dairy-free Italian recipes she has been exploring, which I have linked to in the show notes. On that note, I've also linked to my own very favorite dairy-free desserts, which also just happen to be gluten-free. I think you're going to find this episode really inspiring, whether or not you've had a food sensitivity yourself. And please share this episode with any friends or family members who might be experiencing something similar, because a simple shift in perspective can make a world of difference. As always, an easy way that you can support this work is by sharing it with your people, or you can rate the podcast on your podcast app. You guys know this. Become a subscriber to the Mind, Body, Spirit, Food newsletter. And for just a few dollars a month, you can become a paid member. And as a paid member, you get all of the recipes, you get bonus content, and other fun perks. All right, let's dive in. Well, welcome, Giulia. It's so nice to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and to be able to talk with you almost live.
Almost live, yes. So I'm going to ask you the first question that I ask all of my guests, and that is, what is your cultural upbringing and how has that influenced your relationship to food?
So I'm a Tuscan born and bred food writer and cooking class instructor. And I was born in a very typical traditional Italian family in the 80s. So that is also very important because my grandmother was very connected to traditional food. She used to be a farmer. She had a big garden. She was eating very seasonal and very traditional food. My mom, on the other side, she was working for the whole day. And so she would rely often on frozen meals, or very often frozen vegetables. She was not the best cook, even though now she's way better than when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And so she was not passionate about cooking. So something that you don't expect from an Italian mother. But that was important as well, because even though my mom was working every day and coming back home late, she was still able to cook something very simple and serve warm food at night for me and my sister. And so that was very, very important. So I learned to feed thanks to my mom. I learned the importance of food to make you feel good, make you feel better thanks to my mom. And I learned to cook thanks to my grandmother.
Did your grandmother live nearby? Were you influenced by her? Like, did she teach you some of those traditional recipes that she used to make?
She's 95, almost 96, and she still lives downstairs to me.
Amazing.
I live next door to my mom, and on the first floor, my grandmother is on the ground floor. So we live next door, basically. So I grew up with my grandmother as well. And she taught me the traditional Tuscan recipes, the local ones, because when I ask her a recipe for pisci, for example, a pecan made spaghetti, they're from Valdorcia, about 1 hour from here. She said they are not typical, So what is typical for her is what is very, very local. And so something she knew by heart, basically. Yeah.
So very hyper local cuisine, which is so fascinating. I grew up in the 80s as well, and very similar. My mom worked full time, and there was a lot of fast food, a lot of takeout, just out of necessity. Exactly. And it really, for me, I always had the passion for food. And it was really my drive that led me onto this path. And it sounds like that might have been the same for you. Did you love all foods as a kid, or were you picky, or what was that like?
I was not very passionate about vegetables, even though now it's my favorite ingredient. There were vegetables in the garden, no? But maybe my mom, since she was not passionate, she's still not very passionate about vegetables. That was not the main core of our meals. So I learned to appreciate vegetables growing up. So I was a very skinny kid until I was 5, because I had the adenoids and tonsils. So I couldn't smell the food.
Wow.
Because I was all clogged, basically. Blocked. And then when I had my surgery, I was 5. I still remember exactly the day when, for the first time, I could smell and so taste food. I was sitting at my grandmother's table, and she had prepared these fried cutlets. They're very typical Tuscany. So they're fried and then cooked in tomato sauce. And that first bite, I was like, wow, grandma, this is, so good the first time. And so from that moment on, I was really passionate about food.
Amazing. And then you grew up. Did you always know you wanted to become a food writer and cooking teacher, or how did that happen?
No, it was not my idea growing up. I love food. I love cooking. But still, being a girl from the 80s, I was in love with Working Woman, the movie, and I wanted to be a marketing manager, maybe working in a very important firm. I don't know. So my university studies were about marketing and communication, but then it was not my cup of tea. I worked for a couple of years, for 5 years in marketing and communication. But then in 2009, I started my food blog. And this is when I realized I really wanted to work with food and English, because I started translating the recipes in English after a couple of months, because I had many foreign friends and they were asking me for traditional Tuscan recipes. My first focus was everything that was not traditional, because that was my free corner in the kitchen, cooking something that was not traditional. But after that, I started researching the Tuscan cuisine, and basically I fell in love with our food tradition. And that's where everything began, basically. Yeah.
First of all, my story and your story are remarkably the same. I was an anthropology major in college, but I went into marketing and PR after college and worked for several years. And it taught me exactly what I didn't want to do. And eventually I was living in New York City at that time and quit my job and went to culinary school. I didn't have much of a culinary heritage myself growing up in the Midwest of the United States. But I love, with so many guests that I talk to who are cooks, you had to experiment on your own before you came back to your roots. Yeah. And I find that theme comes up over and over again. We almost have to move beyond ourselves, and then we kind of can then see the value in what is in front of us and where we are. Now, one thing I want to talk about today, you had a recent newsletter and you explain this journey that sounds like it's a recent journey of you having to cut gluten. That's my journey. Cut dairy out of your diet as an Italian who loves cheese. So can you just explain how that went down? What was that journey like?
So basically, after I gave birth to my daughter 3 years ago, I was not feeling 100%. So of course, it takes time to recover. It takes time to, feel your body again. Yeah. But there was something wrong. So I couldn't put a finger on what it was. And I saw many doctors, tried many therapies, but there was something that was not working. And so eventually I found a nutritionist and she told me to do a DNA test on intolerances because she said, I'm pretty sure it might be gluten. At the beginning, she thought this could be gluten. And I was scared, as you can understand. Yeah. But, I had 1 month while I was waiting for the results. And I was always, telling me, okay, I can do even without gluten. I can try experimenting with gluten-free recipes. And I was almost convinced it was gluten. And so when I had the results, it was, no, you can eat gluten. It's dairy. That came as a surprise because really I was not thinking about dairy, this time. Mm-hmm. Of course, eating butter and cream especially was very heavy for me, but I didn't connect all the dots until that very moment. Sure. So there are many things behind these connected to my liver, to other things. But one of the, clearest thing that was to do for me was abandon dairy. So it was not just lactose, but dairy altogether.
I want to pause just because you did mention something in your newsletter, and I just want to say that here, that, and I want to emphasize this is the mind, body, spirit, food community. This is our belief that we're not looking for medical advice. So really within this platform, I just want to emphasize for all of you listeners out there that we respect everybody's choices when it comes to the foods they eat and to their own personal health journey. So I just want to throw that out there because sometimes people just want to give you all the advice. And I know what that feels like. In fact, again, our journeys are so similar because it was after I had my first daughter, who's now 14. It was 2 years. I got really sick. This went on for 1.5 years. And I finally had a doctor who helped me realize that gluten was contributing to a lot of my health issues. And it was a complete shock. For me, I was working at the time as a food stylist. I was working as a recipe developer and a writer. And I had strongly identified myself as somebody who ate everything. And this came actually, for those listeners out there, they know my story. I had a history of disordered eating in my late teens and early 20s. So having to cut something out of my diet felt appalling. And then I also didn't want to be the person at the restaurant, being like, I can't eat gluten. I felt very shamed. I felt very shameful about that. I mean, we live in a very different time now, I will say, but I can't imagine it was easy. How has this affected your identity as a cook and as a human?
Well, you just described exactly and word to word what I was feeling. Because I used to go at the bar, at the cafe in the morning and ask for espresso macchiato. So espresso with a shot of milk. And now I cannot drink coffee. So I have to ask for orzo, which is barley coffee with soy milk. And every time I'm sorry. And I go there with my clients for the cooking classes. So I start, 2 cappuccinos, 1 coffee, 1 espresso, and then I'm sorry. And it was always like, I'm sorry, I need an orzo macchiato with soy milk. I'm still at the I'm sorry phase. And also in restaurants, I'm not used to that because it's very recent. So I'm just scanning the menu, trying to find something that's naturally dairy-free. But again, I'm a food writer, so I develop recipes, I write cookbooks, and I teach cooking classes. And I've always been very proud to be, eating everything during cooking classes because I genuinely love food and I love what my students cook. And I love to share the food. But then I had to start saying, I'm sorry, I just discovered I'm lactose intolerant. But I have to say that working with international students, it's easier than working with Italians. because international students, especially Americans in my studio, they all understand. And so they say, oh,
Yeah.
like I've been there, or I have a friend. And so they are completely okay with me skipping 1 or 2 courses because there's cheese. While my
Yeah.
Italian friends are like, oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't give up cheese. Oh, no, you know what? I'm lactose intolerant, but I'm still eating cheese. Or one of the cheese
Yeah.
vendors at the market, it was so fun because he said, oh, I'm sorry. I hope it will pass. I was like, I hope so, but no. And even my mom and my husband, we are all lactose intolerant. So probably something
Wow.
for me in my DNA. So Italians are,
Yeah.
there's a high percentage of people that are lactose intolerant in Italy. And my mom said at the doctor, okay, I'll just, remove all the dairy, but can I have milk in the morning? Because she used to love her milk and coffee in the morning. Now she loves oat milk. Like in 1 month, she managed to change her habits. So I'm very proud of her.
Amazing.
So that was easier with, students from abroad than with my Italian friends. But first of all, I'm feeling so much better. And this is
Yeah.
giving me all the motivation, all the
Yeah.
inspiration to keep, on this path. And that's the most important thing. I do feel better.
You just said it, because for me, it was like a massive health turnaround. And it wasn't just because of the gluten. The gluten was a contributing factor and a large one, but it was a major one, and it made it so much easier. And in fact, I found that cutting out gluten ended up being a very empowering moment in my life. And a moment where I had always assumed health, first of all, and I'd always assumed that doctors would have the answers for me. And I did work with the doctor, and she's the one who did suggest cutting out gluten. But once I realized that, it turned into this empowering situation for me. It wasn't about a medication for that specific symptom. It was something I could control and I could manage. And I had a direct say in my health for the first time. And I started to feel so much better. And there's nothing that will motivate. If you're feeling as worse as I'm sure both of us did prior, it's actually not that hard to make the change. It's more of an emotional attachment than it is, the physical stuff. It's like, oh my gosh, yay. Aside from starting to feel better, has there been any other surprises that have come with cutting out dairy for you?
It is exactly what you're saying. It came after 3 years when I was ignoring myself and my body. So just to put this in perspective, I gave birth at the end of the first lockdown of COVID. So it was basically the first year of my daughter. We were in isolation. And every symptom I had, I was basically ignoring it because it was, during COVID, you don't want to go to doctors or the hospital. She was very little. Then she started going to daycare. And so I had more time. But this is when my job started after 2 years of break of COVID. So the new cooking classes. So I was super busy. We were super busy. I worked with my husband, and it was a very intense moment for 2 years. And I was ignoring all the symptoms because you had to work, because this is, after 2 years of break, you have to work. And if you have some free time, you spend it with your daughter. But after 2 years like these of cooking classes, I was so tired. And I was lacking completely energy. I was not focused when I was working. And I knew there was something wrong. And as you say, this dairy intolerance is just, contributing to a major situation, but it was a big part of it. And when you start addressing it, and it's like you start solving a puzzle. And so I felt very empowered to start working on my health. And I think this is also, it could be an inspiration for my daughter as well, because I'm not controlling food because, I want to be skinny. I'm controlling food because I want to feel good, because I want to be present for her. I want to have energy to play with her. So that was the first step to, to solve a bigger puzzle that I'm still working on, but the very first effective piece of the puzzle. And so it was really important. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I found, at least in my experience, I mean, we are very fortunate having to go through a journey like this, because you and I love to cook. And so what ended up happening is that, yes, there was something that had to leave my diet. But what I found was then this door opened to a ton of new ingredients that I got to then play with that I had never considered playing with. So it almost was like way more of the experimentation and stuff coming in than I felt that was going out. How has that been for you? Have you started experimenting with dairy-free options?
At the moment, researching traditional recipes that don't have dairy. Or, yes, of course, the
fabulous.
oat milk, soy milk. I was already drinking that in the morning. So that's still, part of my breakfast routine is oat milk and chicory coffee because I cannot have coffee also. And then, for example, the other day I was working on stuffed pasta. And my first idea when I think about stuffed pasta is ricotta. That was one of my favorite ingredients. I would use ricotta everywhere. But then I start thinking, what do we use in Tuscany to stuff pasta besides ricotta? And so there's meat, but there are also potatoes from Mugello, an area of mountains over Florence. And so I start thinking, maybe I can use potatoes instead of ricotta when I want to mix them with vegetables. And so my ricotta and asparagus tortelli became potatoes and asparagus tortelli. So with a little bit of substitutions and adjustments, and they are just as good. They are different. I was not searching for, the same taste, the same texture. I was searching for something different that could still work. That could be seasonal, that could be traditional, because I want to incorporate these recipes into my cooking classes. And we made that, the tortelli during a cooking class, and everyone loved them. And I think it's a nice, a nice idea to try to find something that is already working and try to adjust them into a new recipe. So now potatoes are my go-to ingredient for a filling for pasta.
What? That's just brilliant. And that sounds so delicious. It reminds me, besides a pierogi, I've never had a stuffed pasta with potatoes. And I just can imagine that creaminess on the inside, that suppleness, and how delicious that would be. What are some other Italian recipes let's start with traditional Italian recipes that are just naturally dairy-free?
I want to talk about desserts because that's probably the most difficult aspect for me. And right now I'm just ready to bake a castagnaccio. Castagnaccio is chestnut flour cake. And castagnaccio is naturally gluten-free and dairy-free because it's vegan and gluten-free and without sugar. So it's a very ancient recipe that is at the same time extremely modern because it's good for almost everyone. So it's chestnut flour, water, raisins, pine nuts and walnuts. Baking that for breakfast to have because it lasts for days on your counter. And so that's something that belongs to our tradition and you don't need dairy for that. Another dessert that I really love is from Sicily and it's bianco mangiare. Bianco mangiare is like the blanc mange from France, like white food. And it's almond milk. Almond milk is not milk, cow milk. It's almond milk that is thickened with cornstarch. So again, it's vegan and gluten-free. And so it's also dairy-free. And it's like similar to a panna cotta, but it's even lighter because it's made with almond milk and cornstarch. Yeah. And then usually it's topped with some cinnamon or pistachios or candied orange peel. So it's very typical of Sicily. And they also use the same technique of using the cornstarch to thicken watermelon juice, lemon juice. And so you have this kind of jelly puddings. They are vegan and gluten-free. And that is a great option, especially for the summer, because they're very refreshing. They're very refreshing and light, and you don't need dairy for that. So these are two examples that, come to my mind that are great because they are dairy-free and you don't have to change anything there. They're already working without dairy.
And like you said, for me, exactly, it was the desserts because I feel like within savory cooking, it's much easier to make a substitute for the dairy, to swap out the butter for olive oil or coconut oil or something. But in the baked goods, we rely so much on the butter, on the gluten structure. And to start this journey for anybody who might be starting a journey where they have to cut something out of their diet, to look for those recipes that already exist traditionally and that are just happen to be made without these ingredients. And I think that's a wonderful stepping off point to then start to get more creative because you're like, oh, okay, the chestnut flour, like this is delicious. I bet this could also work in, X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
Are there any substitutes that you have been using? I know you mentioned soy milk, obviously like the milk alternatives, which are so easy to find.
Yeah.
What about other substitutes for instance, for butter or substitute for cheeses? You mentioned the potato instead of ricotta. I think that's a brilliant substitution. Is there anything else?
I had to mention olive oil, of course, because here in Tuscany, we worship olive oil. And so for me, it was very easy to cook everything with olive oil, including risotto. So my family risotto has always started with onion and olive oil, not butter. It's not the traditional recipe, but this is how we've been making this in my family. Even cakes, I love to bake with extra virgin olive oil. So one of my favorite cakes is a cake with extra virgin olive oil and apples. So that was an easy substitution for me. For example, I love to bake vegetables with breadcrumbs on top, like slices of eggplants, peppers, zucchini. And I used to mix cheese in the breadcrumbs. So Parmigiano, Pecorino. What is the role of cheese in this case? It's the umami flavor. So it's the intense flavor. And so I try to substitute that using capers because capers are rich in umami. And so I blend my breadcrumbs with capers and herbs and lemon zest. So basically, I add flavor to my breadcrumbs using other ingredients. So, and it works. It's delicious, especially with zucchini. I try with zucchini for the moment, and I love that. I think I can use also sun-dried tomatoes. I will experiment with that too. But using capers, a little bit, not too much capers, or not too many capers, a little bit of capers blended with the breadcrumbs. You don't taste the capers, but you taste that, depth of flavor that was missing without the cheese.
It was that umami flavor. So you narrowed it down and said, okay, what does the dairy in this recipe, what is the purpose? Exactly. And, I think this is just good cooking instruction for all of our listeners, like the cheese and the ravioli. What is the purpose? That filling. So what has a similar texture or what has a similar, the umami flavor that the Parmesan and Pecorino provided in the breadcrumbs? What a brilliant way to start thinking about substitutions.
Yeah. And I'm just at the beginning because it's like 2 months, 3 months that I'm working with these new perspectives. So I still don't know how to substitute my mozzarella or my burrata. I had to work on that. I will let you know.
Of course. Well, and I feel like, at least for me, the traditional bread at the start of the meal, I just had to get creative and think about other ways to satisfy that craving for something in a different form. And so, for me, that often looks like chickpea fries, panis, or something like that. And it's like, okay, so sometimes it's just a flavor you want to swap out. Sometimes it's a texture you want to swap out, but sometimes it's a feeling. It's a sense of comfort that a specific food can provide. And to look into that, what am I seeking here? And I think these are all important tips. Do you have any other tips for people who might be realizing for themselves or for their children? I have several friends whose children are having a hard time with dairy. Any other tips for cutting out dairy specifically?
I think what is really working for me is a change of perspective. So don't look at what you cannot have. Look at what you can have. Well, look at what you can enjoy. So this is something I realized during COVID, again, when I had to cook with ingredients from my pantry. And so that was a creative approach because, okay, let me see what I can cook today with what I have already in the pantry. So I think it's the same. Of course, I will be missing burrata. I will be missing mozzarella. But what can I create delicious and satisfying with, vegetables? That is my favorite ingredient. How can I experiment with vegetables and have a satisfying, fulfilling meal, even without the cheese? So it's a change of perspective. And I think that's really the beginning. Look at what you can have, look at what you can enjoy and what you really love and start from there instead of looking at what you are missing.
It's like that abundance versus scarcity perspective. If we are only paying attention to what we can't have, this goes, for life in general, we will be miserable. And if we can simplify and see all that we already have, even if it's the simplest things, for me, like sometimes it's just like, I'm like you, vegetables are my favorite things to cook. I find so much joy in the color and in the textures. And it's like,
Mhm.
okay, if I'm feeling down about not being able to eat the pizza, I'm going to craft the best damn salad or the best
Yes.
baked vegetable situation.
Yes. Exactly. Exactly.
Well, I feel like this has been so helpful and so empowering for people to hear that these journeys in our life, they happen.
Yeah.
And while they are hard, undoubtedly, they can also be the doorway to us finding our own health, to opening ourselves up to new flavors and experiences, and to new perspectives, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Giulia, where can people find your beautiful, delicious work?
So I have a newsletter on Substack, and it's Letters from Tuscany. And if you read Italian, I have also the same newsletter in Italian, that is Lettere dalla Toscana. Then I'm on Instagram, Joe's Kitchen. My blog, joeskitchen.com, that is again in Italian and in English. And my latest cookbook is Cucina Povera, that is available worldwide.
And I will link to all of these things. But before we leave, I have one last question for you. This is how I end all my episodes. And that is, it is your last meal on earth. What would it be?
My answer was eggplant parmigiana. I have to change it.
Well, I love that. Okay. We'll say the eggplant parmigiana because it's your last meal. But if you had to choose something that was dairy-free, what would you choose?
Spaghetti, aglio, olio, peperoncino. This is the simplest dish. So spaghetti with extra virgin olive oil, garlic, and chili pepper, and a little bit of fresh parsley. If you can make them correctly, they are a great dish and super simple. So I really love that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate you sharing your story.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If this work resonates with you in any way, you can support it by leaving a review or comment or sharing it with friends. Also, you can sign up for the newsletter, Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. And by becoming a paid member for just $5 a month, you help fund this entire project. Thank you so much to all of you who are already subscribed, especially to those paid subscribers. This work could not happen without you. I'm Nikki Sizemore, and as always, remember to nourish yourself with intention and love.